Good evening. My name is Tommy Kilgore. I am president of the Transylvania branch of the NAACP. And I welcome you this evening on behalf of the Transylvania branch of the NAACP and our gracious host, the Unitarian Universalist Church. Thank you, sir.
Most of you know Dan Carter, and Dan will be a part of the panel tonight. Christiana Glenn Tugman from Asheville, who is an attorney in Asheville. She oversees the homeless programs in Asheville and Buncombe County, and also has been volunteering in the prison since 2009. And she has a lot of inside information, if you will. Alvin Long. Actually, I connected with Alvin through Christiana. And Alvin has had his own experience with drug addiction and has turned his life around and is now overseeing 14 halfway houses in Buncombe and Henderson counties, which he founded. So, thank you. And Larry Goodwin. Larry is from Brevard. Larry is a career drug counselor, career Army officer who founded drug programs through the Army and has been working here since that time in drug rehabilitation of people. We'll start with Dan Carter, and we'll just go right straight across here.
Much of what I might have talked about, I don't need to repeat from the film. Certainly the in-depth remarks about the disproportionate impact of drugs, sentencing, and the drug laws and the war on drugs. My own interest has been on the issues of incarceration. The criminal justice system goes back a long way, but really became much more intense when I spent time in the Netherlands, in Middelburg, and got to know the one of the guards, or they don't call them guards, attendants, I think, and the assistant warden of the large prison in Middelburg. And I made several trips there, talked to a number of the prisoners, and it led me to spend a great deal of time looking at not only what we do in this country, but what other Western democracies have done. And, of course, we can see one of the major differences in the level of incarceration, which is very, very low compared to the United States. But I'm not going to go through all that. What I would like to do in a very, very quickly run through, I'm not going to talk about them, is to simply list the things which could be done, which would make a dramatic difference over the next few years. First, as you've seen, in mandatory sentencing for most crimes. You saw in this film some of the examples of the disproportionate impact. Again, I was struck by this when I was not only in the Netherlands but visited prisons in Europe in general, by the fact that, for example, in most countries for murder, the maximum rate would be 20 years, and most people would actually be released in 7 or 8. Almost all crimes have far, far shorter sentences, shorter sentence lengths than we do, and there's no reason to believe that lengthy prison sentences serve any purpose in terms of preventing return to prison or, in fact, combating crime. A third thing that's really very easy. After evaluation, release large numbers of older prisoners. Studies have shown that prisoners over the age of 55, less than 8% in comparison with 57% for the general population, are likely to commit crime or will commit crimes in the next 5 years. Only 2% will commit any violent crimes in the next 5 years. It's a young man's game. And there's no reason why we should be keeping people as they get older. Fourth, expand alternative ways of dealing with those who break with the law. And here I could spend several hours talking about the difference between Scandinavian countries, between Germany, and particularly Luxembourg and the Netherlands. They simply have far different ways of dealing, particularly with initial offenders. The argument being that staying in prison longer is more likely to make you become a recidivist than releasing you as soon as possible. Another item, provide drug and alcohol treatment facilities in prison and after prisoners are released. I was struck, particularly at the Middleburg prison, by the fact that they had 400 prisoners there. They had one full-time psychiatric social worker, one full-time psychiatrist working with these prisoners in a prison of less than 420. Dramatically reduce the caseloads of parole and prison officers. The recommendation of most experts is for 30 to 35. In the Netherlands, it's 25. Here in the United States, the average caseload is 130. Make a genuine financial commitment to intensive job training and education for prisoners. Few things illustrate our national insanity on this issue more than the 1994 decision by the Congress to remove Pell grants for prisoners. By this time, Pell grants, which allow and give funding for colleges and universities to teach students, had been going on for 8 years. The studies that have been done show that those individuals who have taken part in the programs are 70% less likely to engage in recidivism, that is, to return to prison. It is one of the most extraordinary. The estimates are $8 to $15 return on every dollar with the Pell grants. And what did we do? We took them away. Adopt reforms that will limit the banning of individuals from work. In all of the Scandinavian countries, in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, depending upon the severity of your crime, if you do not reoffend, you can have your name, the felony, completely removed from your record from 2 to 10 years. It depends on how severe the offense is. If you don't reoffend, no employer will then be able to go back and deny you a job because of that. In the process of disenfranchising prisoners, this is a scandal, apart from the impact that it has. The first visit I made to the prison in Middleburg, the three major political parties were setting up booths downstairs in the social hall because the prisoners were going to vote. In every single European country, prisoners vote in prison. As the warden said to me, why shouldn't they vote? We're trying to return them to civic life. What possible purpose is it to prevent them, to make them so alienated from a civic life? So that's all of these things, and I could mention, I have some more here, but I'm not. All of these things are possible, and although they're expensive, in the long run, they are far less expensive than what the process by which we're engaged now. So why don't we do it? Well, one of the reasons you saw in the film, because more and more there are vested economic interests, and there are vested groups, unionized prisoner guards. There are all kinds of interest involved in keeping the system the way that it is. But I want to suggest there are a couple of other factors, and then I'll stop. One is the limited nature of our social support system in this country. To be crude about it, the lack of a truly social welfare system. In a nation where we allow 22% of our children to live in poverty, where millions of Americans are one paycheck away from homelessness, where mental and legal services for the poor and the working class are totally inadequate, where despite the improvements of the last 6 years, over 30 million Americans do not have health insurance. It is difficult for any politician, quite apart from the psychological effects of being tough on crime, it is extraordinarily difficult to make the case that convicted criminals who've done something wrong should be given any resources or additional resources. The final factor is one that several times was alluded to here, race and class. I do think it's striking the extent to which the methamphetamine epidemic has brought home the fact that, yes, it is primarily heavily racial, but it really reflects our willingness to separate groups from our society. I've just been in the last couple of days reading a lot of research about the 19th century. And in reading it, I was struck by the contempt with which middle class and upper middle class people hold not only minorities, but poor people as well. Until we accept the fact that we have had a long history of excluding from our care and concern the other, most clearly embodied in race, but in class as well, most clearly embodied in slavery and segregation, but also in our attitudes toward the undeserving poor, we're not going to make any progress. And that is not something, that cultural change is not something that can be done simply by saying, well, it'll be cheaper or it'll be better or whatever. We have to begin, like all social movements, in creating one-to-one conversations, in developing forums like this, and in other methods of talking to individuals one by one and convincing them that we're on the wrong path and that we have to make dramatic changes.
Hi, my name is Alvin Long. I am that individual that you had just seen in that film, that addict that you would not want to have in your neighborhood, that person that you would look at that you probably wouldn't open your door for. And that was about 9 years ago. That was my life. The degradation that comes along with the addiction, the hopelessness that comes along with doing the addiction, the being put in jail. I have an extensive, not like they have up there on the film, but I've done some crazy stuff. And, you know, what I've done in coming through and looking at this film, I was just sitting here and they suggested that we write something up for ourselves in order to be able to deal with this. But, you know, I've done some prison time. I've done a lot of incarceration and jail time. And, you know, I like to think that the institution I like to think that the police and stuff didn't care in Western North Carolina. I hate to give a plug to Asheville, but unfortunately there was a lot of people there that did not possibly want to see me put myself through that life. There's a lot of things that I probably should have been charged with that I wasn't. Somewhere down the line, no one gave up on me, and that's the big piece about having the disease of addiction is when people really turn their backs, because it's not like a one-and-done scenario. And, you know, for me, this process wasn't easy. There was a lot of shame to go along with it. You know, I had a decent family that I was raised with. My father was in the military. I never stayed any place long enough to get into enough trouble. I was a late bloomer when it came to using drugs. I didn't know what drugs really were until I was in my 20s. My addiction didn't kick off till I was like 27, 28. 25 is when I was just kind of loitering with the intent. That's my term when I'm just hanging out with stuff. And once it took off, it just took off. I can't tell you the number of states that I've been in, but I can tell you what you've seen on that film is true. I've been arrested in multiple numbers of states. The probably smartest thing I ever did was leave those states after I've gotten in trouble. And somehow I ended up here in Western North Carolina, and for some reason, the people that I've worked with, I was a member of the board of Homeward Bound at one time, because I have that inside experience of what it takes to get through some of these pieces of dealing with this disease of addiction. After I had gotten clean, they allowed me to be there. But there were people in the community that didn't give up on me. There were companies that would allow me to work for them, maybe not necessarily hire me, but they gave me an opportunity to work. You know, there was one particular gentleman that stayed with me. You know, he was a farmer. He worked at the farmer's market there, and he would come get me at 4 o'clock in the morning. He would be that one person in my life that tell me things can be better. All you got to do is do something different. You know, there were people that got me involved into the housing program that I did that believed in me because they thought I was smart enough. One lady, bless her heart, her name is Kathy Wright. She died just earlier this year, you know, but she stuck with me when no one else would. And so by having the support that it takes to get through this, and, you know, it's not, for my piece in the fight against, you know, this war against drugs, my piece is to be able to provide people safe housing in the community where they can try to get their lives back together. And that's what someone done to me. You know, they've done that for me to be able to give me an opportunity, you know, to do better in my life. And in watching this film, you know, I was angry at 5:30 this morning when I went to bed watching it, and I woke up angry this morning looking at that because that reminded me so much of me. And you need to see we need to see stuff like that. We need to know that there are forums like this that are going to be willing to work with individuals that do have problems. You know, for me, providing a housing piece, I work in the mental health dual diagnosed part of the process because that, you know, addiction is a mental health issue as well. So we can't just stigmatize people with mental health issues and people with substance abuse issues, because I deal with both of them because they're subject to come out at any one particular time. And the community needs to understand that the support is needed for an individual when they're coming out of incarceration or a person that's trying to change their life. They need that additional support. So it takes, you know, it takes a lot of my time during the day. Let's put it that way. You know, running 14 different homes, you know, I think I have approximately 45 to 50 people that I have to supervise. I have staff that has to supervise over them. You know, I have mentors that work with me in my life to keep me focused and ground to do the things that I have to do. But see, I came out a little bit different. I came out prepared for some of this because I was introduced to ways of changing my life, and the prison system They do have opportunities to do that, but, you know, again, it's about people in the community being willing to be invested in the individuals that are coming out. You can't just let somebody roll up in your neighborhood without any support. My job is to provide the support. You know, what I try to do in the housing piece is get people connected more with the community services that they're going to need, and we do a little bit about accountability and communication. That's the most important thing when a person is coming out. If we can hold them to that ground, probation officers and everybody else that's involved, because it is easy just to give up on an individual coming out of prison. Now, the one thing they have done in Buncombe County is they've done the ban the box. So there's, you know, on a lot of the applications with the bigger companies, you know, you have to interview the person before you check to see if there's a felony conviction. There's a few. I think Mission Hospital and a couple of the other places are getting involved in dealing with stuff like that right now, but. You know, for me, just sitting here I was taking a deep breath because I was thinking about that part in the story when they were talking about that addict, when we're not discussed at the dinner table. Addiction is not discussed in the restaurants. Homelessness and the degradations are not discussed at banquets. Those are conversations that they have in little back rooms. That's why they have the prison sentences and the sentences that they have. It takes the community to get involved to know that there could be a change. There's an opportunity for people to do something different, but they need the support to do it. My housing program provides an opportunity for their support. People coming out of prison can't get jobs right away, but there are temporary job services and people that have come along and willing to give people an opportunity. No one says give 15 people a chance. It says just give one and see how that person works out, because someone gave me a chance. Because I was not one of the nicest people you ever came across, Kareem. Christiana knows me well. She ran a criminal background check on me to see what I was like. It was pretty ugly. She reminds me of that on a daily basis. You know, and when I call her, she's one of my mentors, to tell you the truth. And when I call her with stuff that I think that might be right, and she suggests that I need to look at the responsibilities and accountability that I'm doing today in the community and how I need to hold responsibility, it's someone that's caring for me. But you got to be willing. You know, my job is not easy. I have people that are coming out of prison that are in my homes now. They are part of the Bureau. There are programs available, but it still takes time. This is not something that happens overnight. But me sitting here, just like if you guys were in one of the meetings I like to attend, you would see that there's a change that's coming about. But then on the other half, there is a high influx of drugs rolling into this community as well. And so it's up to the community to be able to step forward and say, we're not going to stand for this anymore. You might need to check the individuals that are around you. Because I wish someone would have stepped up to the plate and said, Alvin, I don't think that's a bright idea. I think you need to go home. I really do. But this was a good opportunity. I'm glad that I was allowed to be here today. And, I'm glad that there are programs like this that's willing to learn to deal with the people with the drug stuff, issues and stuff that's coming up. And I think that's all I have to say for now.
It's nice to be here. Thank you, Alvin. I pick on Alvin constantly. I'm also one of his board members for Biltmore Housing, and so I have a fiduciary responsibility to pick on him relentlessly. My background's a little different, a little mixed compared to some of the people here. I actually do a tremendous amount of work in the prisons. I am the chair for the Community Resource Council at Swannanoa Correctional Center for Women. I run a human rights film forum at Craggy Correctional, the minimum custody facility in Buncombe County as well. And I work pretty closely with Chief Maniabas at the Buncombe County Detention Facility and trying, because when I left the public defender's office, they couldn't really get rid of me at the jail, so I'm still there putting my 2 cents in as it pertains to homelessness and the issues there with education. Follow up with something that Dan had said earlier on the recidivism rates. As part of my relationship with the Community Resource Council, we have a study release program, and studies have shown that people that obtain a degree while in prison the rate of recidivism drops to less than 4%. Less than 4%. Mm. So the investment in that is priceless. Also, with respect to the film and the Pell grants, Obama did change that legislation recently. The film was made before that. Inmates cannot get Pell grants. There's a pilot program currently underway that Obama put into place in the fall of last year. There are, I think, 2 counties that were selected in North Carolina, Rowan and Wake, so that the Pell Grant for Inmate program will be coming back. Unfortunately, Asheville-Buncombe lost out. We did try. But under the old law, if you had been convicted of a drug felony, you were denied the right to a Pell Grant even after your release. That has been changed. There are still certain restrictions with respect to whether or not you were receiving a Pell Grant at the time you were convicted of a drug offense. Then you go on like a probationary period, but it's still restorable. So there's undeniable momentum moving at higher levels to try to rectify what had been done 10 years ago. So I wanted to point that out because they said it twice in the film, and I was very pleased that Obama had changed the legislation that had been put forth in '94. So another thing that I did when Jim contacted me initially, he was not aware of the fact that I actually do a human rights film forum at Craggy. So the irony here in that you're watching a film about prison and I go to the prisons and show them films about the outside world as it pertains to human rights and genocide. And then we have discussions like this. So it was, of course, an opportunity to just see the duality that's going on with this. Part of my involvement with that is to try to restore human beings' ability to connect to their emotions, to their feelings, to have discussions about things that are important to them, why they're important. Over and over again, I am surrounded by inmates with horrible stories about what their lives were like before they entered prison, before they became addicted, while they were addicted, and then, of course, what happens to them in prison. And one of the main things that you learn when you're an inmate is to conceal your feelings at all costs. And after years of incarceration, how do we expect these people to survive? How do we expect them to adjust when they leave that? And a lot of them cannot. So they've masked their feelings for so long. They haven't dealt with what is really at the core issues for why they were, as I forget the doctor's name in the film, they're covering their pain. And they've been covering their pain for a very long time. So I do my best to try to restore some dignity to them and to let them know. And as Alvin said, I may see hundreds of inmates, but I just need one. And then when that one's done, I'll move to the next, and the next, and the next. And if everyone here could just connect with one, that's a human being that you can save. And that you can look to your right and say, this is my friend.
Hi, folks. My name is Larry Goodwin. I set up my first substance abuse outpatient program in 1971. Helped set up a program in 72 that would now be called a partial hospitalization program. Helped set up a 60-bed inpatient substance abuse program in 1978. And by 1982, I had helped open up 2 more inpatient programs and find myself assigned as a drug and alcohol consultant for the Army in Europe with clinical oversight of 6 inpatient programs totaling 190 beds and 57 outpatient programs. I spent the first half of my career setting up programs and the last half tearing them down because all the money, treatment money, public and private, was pulled out of treatment and put into interdiction and incarceration. Now, I introduced myself that way not just to justify my ability to talk about treatment, but to bring out several points we have to bring to the table if we want to really talk about the war on drugs. The 1972 program was set up at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and this was set up in anticipation of all the hordes of heroin addicts we were expecting back from Vietnam. The only problem was we found out that once most of the people got back from Vietnam, they didn't need to be heroin addicts anymore. Very few of them were chemically dependent. Most of them were using drugs situationally. And what was their situation? Well, they were afraid, they were angry, they had feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, no confidence in the authority figures to protect them, a lot of peer pressure to use drugs, and an overwhelming attitude of stick it to the man, just this idea of authority being in the wrong. And if you stop and think about it, that's not totally unlike some of the circumstances some of our brothers and sisters of color are living in today. Folks, if you change the social, economic situation and environment so that you do not have as much hopelessness and helplessness, drug use will decrease. Now, there are some that have used enough to become truly chemically dependent. And the chemically dependent people, this indicates a total loss of control, both physically, emotionally, familially, and spiritually. And that requires treatment. In 1978, the 60-bed inpatient program we set up was the Tri-Service Alcoholism Recovery Facility at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. It was called an alcoholism recovery facility because, by definition, the military did not have drug addicts. If anyone was found using drugs other than nicotine or alcohol, they were given a less than honorable general discharge. They weren't treated. And, of course, that made it very difficult for them to find work. Not as bad as being a convicted felon, but at least having 2.5 out of 3 strikes. It made it very difficult. During my 8 years at that program over 2 different tours, we had dozens of military people that, excuse the expression, trumped up an alcohol history so they could be treated. In essence, their chemical abuse was something else. But they couldn't get treated for that, so they made up an alcohol history. Now, myself and other clinicians decided to use our own informal don't ask, don't tell system, and we treated these folks. And we found that they did just as well in treatment as the thoroughbred alcoholics. Now, how well did they do? Well, we found out in a longitudinal study we did in '86 that 87% of our patients were totally abstinent 2 years post-treatment. And if you added those that had had a brief relapse followed by at least 1 year of abstinence, that number went to 94%. Now, these are phenomenal numbers that the civilian world has probably never seen. But you see, we had a few things going for us that the civilian world didn't have. Number one, we provided 6 weeks of intensive inpatient treatment followed by a 1 year mandatory outpatient treatment follow-up. No insurance company, public or private, is going to give you authorization to do anything close to that. Also, all our patients were employed. They were active duty military. They were making a living wage. They were discharged to a community that supported a drug-free environment. They also had a good chance of being promoted if they stayed straight because they were in an institution, an organization that had a relative lack of institutional racism. Now, treatment needs to be augmented with social changes that support this kind of an environment. Now, treatment works. It's been proven that it works. Incarceration does not. A lot of prisons, the availability of drugs is not that different from on the community street corner. Even if you don't get drugs in prison, the chemical dependency doesn't go away. It's just on hold. And when an addict is discharged, they don't start over on their addictive career. They start right back at where they left off and take off from there. In fact, it'll probably increase because there's one thing they learned in prison is that authority figures are even nastier than they thought they were, and they're that much angrier, and they're going to be using to that effect. Let's try this scenario. Let's say I worked in the emergency room a couple miles down the road here, and somebody presented with a heart attack. And being a small community, I knew this person, so I said, look, this heart attack is your fault because you're overweight, you don't have any physical activity in your life, and you exercise no dietary constraint whatsoever. Therefore, I'm not going to treat you. I'm going to incarcerate you. I'm going to put you in prison so we can monitor your caloric intake and mandate a physical activity program. And by the way, when you get out, you're going to be a convicted felon, and your ability to take care of yourself and your family is going to be nil. Sounds pretty ludicrous, doesn't it? Folks, it is no different than incarcerating instead of treating a chemically dependent person. It is the incarceration of chemically dependent persons that should be criminal, not the activity that led to the diagnosis. Thank you.
I'd like to give you an opportunity to ask questions. Again, keep in mind that this is being recorded. And when you get the microphone, don't start asking until you get it. You're going to hold it just like this, about this far from your mouth and straight on. And we'll open it up to questions.
I think this is a question principally to Alvin and Larry. You're both conducting programs that obviously require financial support. Where is your financial support coming from, and how are you managing to get it in an environment where nationwide there is very little in the way of finances being put into these programs?
Peter, can I say that?
Want to get Carol now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so.
Do I need to cover my ears?
No.
Okay.
I started my program from scratch. It was suggested to me that in the community that I've done this before. I was working with a group that ran a transitional housing program, recovery style program for the community, but they got shut down. So when I started mine in 2010, it's all self-funded. The clients and individuals that stay in the house, their money's coming from work, Their money comes from different organizations. I have some support. I had some support from Mission Hospital that they pay for when a client come in. There's some parent support. There's some individuals that work. There's some Social Security funds. So basically, for me, for my particular program, it's up to the individuals to provide their funds. So there's no grant money. There's no grant. Yeah, there's no grant funds. There's no one rolling in and saying, I'm going to give you a couple, I'm going to give you 20 grand so you can continue doing what you're doing. I don't get any of that. All this, my whole program is self-supporting. So the individuals that are there really want to be there.
And because of the issues you brought up, I am not currently working in the addictions field. What brought me to Brevard was to work in and eventually run the Bridgeway program, which was at our local hospital doing good work for over 25 years. We had to close that down in October of '99. We were the last not-for-profit drug and alcohol program in the state to close. We tried our darndest, but the funding was just not there. So in essence, there is very little treatment available. There are a few public programs that have long waiting lists, and the private sector is still, since this state revamped its whole mental health system, we're all in trouble.
Yes, I appreciated Dan's comparison to Europe. I wonder if there's any success stories in the United States regarding the benefits of decriminalization.
Well, it's still too early to tell, but several states have begun the process in Colorado and in California. They're particularly on marijuana and some lesser, low-level drugs or whatever. We still don't know. What we do have, of course, is the experience of many European countries which have decriminalized, and it has not led to a substantial increase in drug addiction. It's not without its problems. I would not say that it solves all your problems, because it has to be accompanied by something that we seem unwilling to do, and that is the funding that's necessary for drug treatment and the alternatives. It's different. But what we have to keep our eyes on is that with all the differences between the United States and other countries, why is it that we have a recidivism rate of 57% when, admittedly, Norway is very unusual at 20%, but many of the countries in Western Europe are in the 30s, and yet they incarcerate individuals who are far less dangerous, less involved in super serious crimes, and that are the individuals they do incarcerate have often been involved in very serious crimes, unlike in the United States, where you have people, far more individuals incarcerated with minor offenses, and yet they still end up like Canada, like Australia, like not just the Nordic countries, but the Netherlands and other countries as well, with a much lower recidivism rate. There's got to be something we can learn from those countries, I think, if we would.
I'd like to add to that answer. Frontline did a program a few weeks ago about Seattle's program to deal with heroin addicts and addiction. And there is no punishment at all. In fact, they have trained counselors, social workers, actually going to where these people are using and so on. They showed people actually injecting heroin on camera. And there's no punishment at all. And they follow these people and continue to say that they're there to support them. And when the people are ready, they come in and get treatment. This program's been going on, I think, for 3 or 4 years now. And of course, with legalization of marijuana, the latest statistic I read was that when Colorado legalized marijuana, the amount of marijuana coming across the border from Mexico dropped by as much as 70%. Other questions?
I have a friend who's a
fellow member of St. Philip's Church, early 50s, very bright, drugs, fraud, and so forth to support his habit. And he'll be getting out in 2 years, 2 months, and about 3 days. He's a graduate of Chapel Hill journalism, brilliant mind. He went through New Direction, a program at Craigie, and he's doing very well. You spoke about the need for finding an individual to support. St. Philip's has done a masterful job of that. I've had the privilege of being part of it. But I was in Highland Books one day to send a book to him. When he was in Medium, you couldn't send a book directly. You had to do it through a bookstore or a publisher or Amazon. And Peggy Hansen said to me, you'd be amazed at how many people in Brevard have families in prison, a family member in prison. They're going to be coming out sometime, and some of them are going to be coming here. My concern is what we're going to do when my friend gets out and some of these other people get out. One of the things at St. Philip's, we're in the early stages of developing a family support program for families of prisoners. But if the climate can be changed here so that those people coming out have a hope of making it, that's what I'm concerned about. Is my friend going to be able to get a job? And so forth.
Just so you know, that person that Dick just spoke of was supposed to be here on our panel tonight. And at the last minute, the prison hierarchy denied that request. When I met Christiana in December, I sat in her office for 20 minutes, and she said, how'd you like to go into the prison with me to see this film? And I did, and it was wonderful. It was just wonderful. There were 22 inmates sitting in front at Craigie Minimum, and the person that Dick was talking about was in the audience, and we talked later, and I didn't realize that's who it was until I realized that Dick was bringing him here, and I met him here, and it was amazing. But there are all kinds of opportunities, and I looked out at those 22 inmates, many of them based on how they responded to questions and their comments they made, and I thought, what an incredible waste of humanity. Just what a tragic waste of human potential. So there are opportunities to volunteer here. I've talked to David Mahoney, and he said there are opportunities to volunteer in our jails here. There are opportunities to volunteer in the prisons in Asheville. But there are many ways that you can be involved in this, and you learn a whole lot as you do. Other questions?
Yeah, I think Jim just answered my question here, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway. I think, like probably 99% of the people in here, I agree that we certainly need major institutional and social change. But Christiana said something that really resonated with me, and it took me about 40 years to learn this. And it sounds kind of simplistic, but the one-on-one approach, it's not going to solve the whole problem, but it's one of the last approaches that we often take. We want to reform a system, which is fine. We want to advocate, which is fine. But if we could find one person, and they're out there, and Jim was just started talking about volunteer, it can just make a huge difference. If you had 5 or 10 people in this room that committed to finding one of those people who was an addict or homeless or whatever, and I think Alvin would attest to this, somebody stuck with you. And somebody who's willing to do that. I know AA has, I don't know that much about it, but I think they have sponsors. I had a good friend who was in AA, and he kept falling off the wagon, but his sponsor just kept hanging with him. So that one-on-one approach, I'm convinced, is going to do almost as much, maybe more than a lot of institutional change.
You want to say something?
See, the thing that makes my program so interesting is no one comes to my house without being interviewed. And the importance about the interview and part of the process and it's not just making the business successful, but when you're going to deal with a person at Broughton Hospital or whether it's Craigie Institute, it doesn't matter where they're at. It's the idea of looking at them face to face so they can look at you and you know what the intent is. You know, my big piece with them is always communication and accountability. And that's the piece that's interesting in learning to build relationships, because I need to set boundaries and I need to set terms in the relationships with the people that are coming out. Knowing they're addicts, there's a high possibility it's not going to go well the first time out. But if you sit there and you're looking at them, you know. There's just something, you know. When I go home at night, I know there's one person that I'm brought into my house. They're going to call me at 12 o'clock at night and say, he's doing exactly what you thought he was going to do. And I don't even get excited about it. I just get up. I go discuss the situation with him. And see, for me, I'll go find you. I got this thing about finding. I hate people to leave me, you know. And you're not supposed to find people that are doing stuff you're not supposed to be doing. But I got this thing.
Abandonment issues.
I got abandonment issues. So I will go find you, you know. Because, see, someone came and found me. Someone opened that door up for me. And so what I'm just doing, I'm just giving back so freely what other people have given to me. And, you know, and I've sucked the life out of a whole community here in Buncombe County. You can best believe I did my damage, but I'm giving back. You know, they don't ask for much. They just say, just don't go back to jail, Alvin. Don't get back in any more trouble and keep doing what you're doing. Because they keep sending me people doing what I was doing, so it makes it so much easier for me to not do it anymore, you know? So, well, that's what they do, Christiana.
Just to follow up on what you said, yes, the one you help, but it's also, because I work primarily with the women, it's their children, it's their parents. So the one life you change continues, it's a ripple effect, and it continues to go out. And while we need to make changes within the institutions, I don't know if each of those people can wait. And so that's my inroad to see what I can do now and then continue to do these other things that the system mechanisms, they need to change. Our culture needs to change on how we perceive these people, on what we hold as important. And the people that are sitting there waiting, they can't wait for that.
One of the aspects of this conversation that troubles me is that there is an implicit assumption that the problem is the offender. And I wonder and I recognize that the people whose lives are changed profit immeasurably from that change. But what is it about this society that is so bloodthirsty and seeking revenge on these inmates for crimes that are not against the public at all? And how can we go about addressing that larger problem?
Now, can I just respond to that? Because this is another example of I don't think that anything's going to be done about it. We're 50 states. We're hundreds of counties. But one of the things that I was really struck when I was in Germany talking to the son of a friend of mine who's a judge there is the extent to which the judicial apparatus, the prosecution apparatus is protected from the public. I mean, as I said to him, what if you let someone go and they commit a crime? And he looked at me and he said, well, I sure as hell don't have to be reelected by the public next time around. I'm appointed, and it's not a permanent appointment. But he is appointed by a panel of experts who periodically reevaluate them. And as long as we have the culture that we have that wants that revenge, Peter, and a political system which rewards individuals who feed into that system as we saw in the film and at every local level, exacerbating it, then we're in real trouble. And I just want us to ask ourselves one question. Does anybody know of a prosecutor or a judge who was defeated because he was too tough on crime?
Ron Moore, Buncombe County.
Yeah, that's Buncombe County, though. That cesspool of iniquity there.
was struck by the political angle, from the very beginning of the film. And following on Peter's remarks, I think it's part of what troubles me to this day, and it never was more evident, but that we have this uncanny ability to take the word of the president or the head of this agency or that as the gospel truth. How do we get, in today's local paper, the Transylvania Times, the lead story is Transylvania County's health rating. We're 12th in the state on a certain level of health services. We're in the bottom third of what they would refer to as unintentional death. And they go on to report that much of that is due to drug use. I was optimistic, planning to come tonight, thinking this will really pull people from all throughout the community, not just the believers and the already concerned, because of the depth of the way that drugs reach into so many lives and their prevalence in our culture and in this county. Knowing that politics is local and that we saw these leaders responding to throwing the red meat that people want, the convictions, the long sentencing. How do we educate, starting probably locally, to address, to inform, to educate, to bring about some intelligence about the truth of the matter and how we can, as citizens, demand the kind of response, the kind of service from our government that is service and not just creating this vast industry of incarcerating people with problems.
Well, I'm not aware of what the judicial system is here in Transylvania County, but I'm pretty sure you don't have a drug court, correct?
No.
Yeah. So you have no specialty courts to deal with these populations whatsoever.
I spoke to David Mahoney about that, and he said one of the problems is we don't have the court space. Plus, the calendar is we don't have enough judges and so on to do it. Now, that's not the whole answer, I'm sure, but that's certainly a piece of it.
Well, I mean, I know at least within Buncombe County, they were over, and it took a lot of lobbying on several people's parts, the community's people, really pushing for that before it happened. But, we now have set up a drug court, we have a DUI court, and we have a veterans treatment court. So there are actually 4, if you count the nuisance court. There are 4 specialty courts within our system, and the VA court was denied year after year, and then finally went through March of last year, I believe it was. Okay. So, I mean, that was a push from the community and from the judicial system itself, but it takes changing that culture and not rewarding the people in power that put people away for 15, 20, 30 years for possession of a crack rock. Where it breaks it down and say, let's at least do this much. This much we can do.
See, I can bring a halfway house over here, or a transitional house. I can just, boom, pop up in your community somewhere.
You have no zoning, of course you can.
I like that man. I like him. I needed to hear that. But the reality of the situation is the natural supports that it's going to take. The support that it takes to bring the individuals out of the incarceration needs to be in place as well. Someone to do the substance abuse certification, someone to work on the mental health part of it, someone that they can depend upon, because you can do anything you want to do in the community, except if you don't have the supports that it takes to keep the people going, you're going to get the same results. And, for me, my program, we insist that you engage in the areas of support that you need to be able to get what you need, so you don't keep repeating the same offenses time and time again. So.
Yes, I wanted to give a partial answer to Peter Mockridge's question. When we lived in Texas, the number one contributor to the state legislators was CCA, the Corrections Corporation of America, and they were giving it well in excess of $100 million a year to legislators. And I don't know, but I would be willing to bet money that that's repeated in many other states. There's a lot of money to be made off of exactly what we're talking about tonight.
I'm going to invoke a religious cliche and say, thank you, you're doing the Lord's work. Like so. Everybody hear me? Yeah. But if each of us did something with one person, and that was a successful effort, we still would be just putting a minor dent into the problem, and that's important. But we have to take a look at the political economy that created this problem. And the political economy that created this problem has given us a state of, 1, permanent austerity, and 2, permanent war. And with permanent austerity and permanent war, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to mobilize a country around social issues and pressing health issues like this. We have to change it, and I don't really think it's a culture. The word cultural problem has come up a number of times here tonight. It's a political problem. It is, at essence, a political problem, and it transcends attitudes and it transcends prejudices. And when you get past that and look at it as a political problem, then the same entity, the structure that created it, can be held and should be held responsible for dealing with it.
Well, if I could say something to that.
People back there.
Yeah, it is only putting a dent in it, but it means a lot to that one person. And the one person, let's see, in North Carolina, I have not looked at the math recently, but I believe it's $38,000 per year per person to incarcerate them. Yeah, that's right. So, $38,000. That is more than most people make on $10 an hour for 40 hours a week. 2 people, yeah. My human calculator. That's why I went to law school. You can't do math. But that's $38,000. I think it's $43,000 for juveniles per year. And if you think about the cost that we're bearing already, and then with the new statewide misdemeanor sentencing program here in Trent, you are bearing those costs here. Because all misdemeanors are now sentenced to local jails. They no longer go to prison, which means they are being housed here, and you are paying for that already. So if there's anything you could do at the local level, even go to the jail. Engage people while they're still a misdemeanor before they become a felon. Because the collateral consequences of having a felon, if you are a convicted felon, the collateral consequences that stem from that are enormous. Enormous. I believe there are over 900 federal and state statutes that are applicable in North Carolina that prohibit you from engaging in work, holding professional licenses as a convicted felon. The list goes on and on. You can't be a tow truck driver. You can't work in a nursing care home. I mean, it just goes on and on. So with your friend that's coming out, what are his employment chances? Slim to none unless we start changing that culture. It's a cultural problem that's mirrored in our politics because it's convenient and it's easy to otherize people.
I think your idea that attitudinal changes are going to have to start with a political change is probably correct. A little bit ago, you heard me talk about discharging military patients to an environment that supported a drug-free environment, drug-free place. That didn't exist when I first went in the military. In 1970, if you didn't go to officer's call and drink with the boys, it was bad on your efficiency report. Well, what I saw over 20 years in the military is by instituting different regulations, we could change the environment. And we did change the environment. You could no longer stack drinks at closing time at the officers' club. There's several things that took place. And it did change. Now, that's a much more closed system to work with, but I am convinced communities can have the same effect if we start with the political regulations to do so. Thank you.
Can I just add one thing? I think Wayne and I agree. The politics is important. I sometimes think the symbols are important, too. Every time I drive past one of the convicts groups here in Transylvania County wearing those striped uniforms, my blood pressure goes to about 180 over 90. I have talked with the sheriff about it. He's totally non-responsive about it because I don't think he sees any problem with it. But this is a perfect example of the fundamental problem that we mark people off. We have no empathy for them. We see them as somehow others. And to me, dressing somebody up in an outfit which is so deeply, deeply involved in the history of this region, of slavery, chain gangs, the whole incarceration system, is I like a lot of things about the sheriff, but this one really gives me problems.
If you don't recognize them, they got a big sign that says inmate working right out there on the road.
Yeah.
I'd like to mention that we're at 9:15, and I'll stay here all night. I'm sure you won't, but I will, as long as there's somebody who wants to talk about this. But we've got a couple of people who have to go to work tomorrow morning, and they have to drive back to Asheville. But knowing them, I think they'd probably stay here all night too if you're willing to talk about it. I just want to make you aware of that. I'm not putting a damper on any of this. Norm?
Just wanted to make a couple of observations. First of all, I've dealt with the whole prison thing, the jail thing, the courts, incarceration. In the way of a revelation, for those of you who don't know, my son was a drug addict, and I shouldn't say was. You don't ever really get over that. You know, it's with you. I would say that he has gone through long periods of recovery, but I'm very well aware of what happens in the courts and how they affect your life. And what happened to him when he came out was as devastating as what happened when he went in. He couldn't find a job at the time. I don't believe he was allowed to vote. I think there was a time in our state when you couldn't vote if you were a convicted felon. What it did to our family and how even economically, I will tell you, he went through every penny of my life savings, every penny, between lawyers and counselors and this and that. And if I had to do over again, I don't know that I'd do anything different. So for me, the story that I'm hearing is it's something I understand from a parent's point of view. Visiting him in jail was one of the most horrific things I ever did in my life. And I would be willing to bet as I look around this room that a bunch of other people have done the same thing. And I wouldn't ask you to raise your hands because not everybody want to do that. But I'm sure of that. The other part of it is one of the things I heard in the movie that was very telling to me, and it should be obvious to anybody who's been around since the 1950s or 60s, is that our country has changed dramatically over the years. We used to have factories where we built cars and refrigerators, and there were all kinds of factory-based industries for people who were living in those cities, and I heard that reflected there. And so people don't have something to reach out for in our inner cities for the most part. Even here in Transylvania County, we really haven't had a massive recovery of our economy. And people are not finding good-paying jobs in our economy right here in this county. Things are a little bit better in Buncombe County. Things are a little bit better in Henderson County where some factory-type work has become available. But not so here in our county. I think you all know that. So for our people coming out of prison, out of jails, their opportunities are even less in Transylvania County than they might be in Buncombe or in Henderson County. Those things are really tough. It just occurs to me that we have been locked in by all kinds of changes in the way our country works into a situation where people can't find good paying jobs. And they do exactly what's described in this movie, in this film. They seek financial support some other way, in an addictive way that then becomes a mental health disease that they have to fight and struggle with. I've seen that struggle go on in my own life, and I know how terrible it is. Well, right now, in Transylvania County and in counties all over North Carolina and all over the United States, people are struggling with how to put food on the table. We have industries, a new kind of industry. We have fast food industries. We have Walmarts. We have stores like that don't pay enough money for people to live on. And they don't offer people very many career opportunities. I just think that one of the things we have to do is accept the fact that the new industry in our country may well be service industries, store-based industries, fast food-based industries. And if those are our industries, then we need to pay the people working in them a wage that makes it possible for them to have the dignity of a decent life. And that's my observation that I come from this movie and from the discussion I've heard. People need a chance. I remember, I'm a school principal, and I remember a young woman, Rebecca, who came to my school, had her first job. It was her first teaching job. And I remember looking at her and the look on her face when she collected her first paycheck. She cried. She was so proud of herself. People feel pride when they make a decent living. They feel a sense of worth and a sense of empowerment. They feel like they can go out and live a decent life and do the things that don't necessarily involve, as Larry said, don't necessarily involve addiction and drugs, because a lot of people will not be chemical dependent when they can take care of their lives. And I believe that. The other thing I'd say is where's the CCA money? I'd like to find it. Anyway, thank you all very much for listening to that.
One more, please, and then, like I said, we're with time constraints.
And I need a wrap-up, too.
Okay. I want to say that there is a livable council. There is a livable council list here. Wait, that's not what it's called. A living wage council list. So you can support companies and restaurants and other things that do pay a living wage in this county.
We have a gentleman here waiting to ask.
Just three quick comments. One related to what Peter said. I've been in business for a long time, and I've got a handful of employees that have done some substantial prison time. I don't care my guys' backgrounds. If they can do the job for me, I'm quite happy with it. However, it's not just as easy as one-on-one. I've got to make determinations before I take a job if my employees can go on the site. I can't work in tunnels. I can't work on military bases. I've got people that I've had to stand up and tell the insurance companies to go to hell because they won't let my guys drive for me because they haven't had driver's licenses for 3 years because they've been incarcerated. So it's a struggle. It's not just as easy as picking a guy off the prison and hiring him. It goes well beyond that. It's a battle. Two other comments. Dan, what you said bothered the hell out of me. The other prisons that you visited in Europe, they had unionized prison guards too. Am I correct? Then how is that the problem? You got to look at the higher ups, not the prison guards. Third point is you're wrong about CCA being the biggest contributor to the legislature in Texas. It's the poor schmucks with the pound of pot on I-40. They're the ones that are paying the legislature. 15, 20 grand a pop. Oh, yeah. No, the guys that get caught. The guys that get caught with the pound of pot.
Could you say that again? We have this point about this funding.
Oh, no, the poor schmuck getting caught with a pound of pot on I-40 is the one that's funding them.
Yeah, with the civil forfeiture. Yeah.
I just want to ask a quick question of Christiana. I've heard several comments about the Women's Correctional Center in Swannanoa. Mm-hmm. I believe you're connected with that, some work there?
Yes, no, I don't work there. I'm the chair for the Community Resource Council.
You work with...
I work for the city of Asheville as the homeless lead for Asheville Buncombe and the consortium, which includes Transylvania. I volunteer there about 20 hours a week.
My question was the mediation center in Asheville Buncombe, I know, also plays a role at the Women's Correctional Center. And I used to be a mediator here, and I don't know how much of the mediation center we have left now. But can you see, we weren't allowed to mediate drug cases, of course, but can you see a role for expanding the mediation or how that could help with this problem?
As it pertains to people being arrested and convicted, or because there's a reentry mediation program run by the Mediation Center and Executive Director Laura Jeffords in Swannanoa Correctional.
Okay, so that's for women coming out of the correctional center.
Correct.
Yes, and I'm saying, is there a place for that here that we could? I don't know how much is left of our old mediation center, the Center for Dialogue, but could it be
I could see that being very.
Could it play a role? That's all I'm asking.
I could see that being very useful at the county jail, because those people can serve up to 180 days, or if they're boxcarred, which is stacking offenses, they could be there a year. If they're DUI, they could be there 2 to 2.5 years in the county jail. So they're still coming out just like they were in prison, except they don't have the benefit often of programs. The programs are in the state prisons and not at the local level. So they're often deprived of education. They have no GED classes typically in jails. They have no groups. Sometimes AA or NA will come in. They have no ability. Some of them are permitted to work release, but that's where it's lacking. That's been the law in, I think, 2.5 to 3 years. And so the counties are now picking up those costs, but as a cost-saving measure, the programs are not there for those people. So I would see that you could do something that would be very worthy to help restore the family dynamic before those people are released so they can go home and pick up their lives.
This is more of a comment than a question, but and on 7/11/2013, my father was arrested for having a business under brmcrc.org. He, what people like to say, ran a medical dispensary in Fletcher, North Carolina. It was obviously illegal, but he had tax stamps. He had Art of Healing license. He had NC Corporation, stuff like that. He had a lot of legal stuff that made it seem, even though it was illegal, it was very unusual how it happened. But he got raided, and a lot of stuff has happened since then. I got diagnosed with stage 3C ovarian cancer at the age of 14. I have overcome it, and I am a completely healed person as of today. And I would just like to say that thank you. A lot of stuff has happened not only to my father since he has been incarcerated, which has been 1 year since the 26th of March. 13 months to go. I lost my sister, not to death, but to personal information that had a big impact on us, and she is no longer with us. I only have my mother as of now, and as a teenager, you need both parents. It's hard with one, and I understand. My father was a big part of my life, and he is taken away from me because he was helping others, healing others, and no one wants to look at cannabis as a plant. They want to look at it as a drug. In my opinion, cannabis is a very helpful medicine, not a drug. And a lot of impacts have happened on me and my mom since my father's been taken away. That's one less income. That's one less person around the house to help around. And that's one less person to take care of his 16-year-old daughter. I would just like to point out that a lot of things happen not only to the inmate, but to the family as well.
Do we have any other questions or comments? Yes.
We've spoken or listened to conversation about after the fact of the arrest and whatever. Has anything changed in North Carolina at the street level? I don't mean it negatively, Chief, but is it still business as usual? For example, I can remember years ago in L.A. when the amount of marijuana you could be caught with and not go to jail had changed, and all the cops had little tiny balance scales. But I don't mean it necessarily the picky-unish thing, but is the law still the same, and are we still sweeping people up the same way?
I can tell you that my police department is going to enforce the law as it's written. Every year we have a few changes. As far as changes on the drug laws, I don't recall any in the last 5 years, but there probably have been some minor ones. But if we want change, the laws have to change. Oh, my name's Phil Harris. I'm the chief of police in Brevard.
Got somebody back there.
Okay, we'll take a few more.
We're gonna have to wrap it up pretty quickly here.
I heard the idea of advocating for a drug court, like some places have drug courts, DUI courts. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that, I think, Christiana.
Yes.
Would you explain how a drug court would work? I don't know if I'm the only one who doesn't understand that. And then maybe how would we advocate for that, if that would help?
Talk to him.
I have nothing to do with the courts.
But you'd make a good advocate.
We're one part of the criminal justice system.
Right. I did not work in the drug court. I worked for the public defender's office in Buncombe County. It has a drug court, and I worked under Courtney Booth, who was the lead attorney for the Buncombe County Drug Court. The drug courts are basically set up. They are for people who have been convicted, well, at least they're convicted of high-level felonies that are drug-related. So it may be a breaking and entering charge, but they were attempting to obtain money to support their habit. So it's not exclusively drug possession. I believe they do not allow drug traffickers into drug court. There's some ebb and flow there with the district attorney's office because here, I think it's 27 pills is considered trafficking weight in North Carolina. Is that correct, Chief? 27? Roughly. Yeah. And that's a 2-day to 3-day supply for a hardcore addict. So it's not necessarily. So they would look at the entire history of the person. It's a 1-year commitment. They go to, they're supervised by probation, parole. They have to comply with your analysis, look for work or education. They come twice a month, I believe, and they appear in front of the superior court judge, and their cases are reviewed. And sometimes they relapse, and they're put into jail for a quick dip, 2 to 3 days, straighten them back out, come back out. They have like levels. They work levels of improvement until they ultimately graduate, and at that point, that conviction is expunged. So
it leaves the pressure on a normal prison system, right?
Yes. Oh, it's far cheaper to run a drug court than it is to incarcerate them.
I'd like to say a couple of things about the drug court, and you'll see that on the back sheet here of your handout. The last I read, there are about 3,400 drug courts in the United States, and your question used an important word, and the word is advocacy. And that's a lot of what you can do. And what that starts with is educating other people. Alvin mentioned that we don't talk about this over dinner. We've grown up we've created a society that stigmatizes addiction and the people who use drugs, and we have to get over that. We have to remember that these people who are abusive and addictive are ill and need to be treated just like Larry said. If it was a heart attack, these people are ill. We have to get over that stigma. We have to begin to talk to each other about this subject. The drug court is going to take a lot of changes in this society. I mean, it isn't just going to, isn't going to happen by itself. But if you spread the word and encourage other people to become educated about this, if we get enough people there advocating, it'll work. You don't have to stand on a street corner with a sign. just when you're talking to somebody and the subject comes up and you hear them say something that you know is incorrect, say, well, let me tell you what the real story is here. And that's really what this evening is about, is I hope you were changed. I hope you're a changed person from the person you came in. And you realize what a pervasive and difficult problem this is. There's so much that we haven't even mentioned here tonight. Learn about addiction science. Learn about how the brain works. Learn about the teenage brain, which is incredibly vulnerable to drugs. For a person to use drugs under age 18 or abuse drugs, there's a 1 in 4 chance of addiction. After the age of 25 or 30, it's a 1 in 25 chance. Hugely different. So our teenagers are incredibly vulnerable. But we can't legislate that away.
We have
one last question, and then I'm going to wrap it up.
My question really is...
Put the mic closer.
Oh, sorry. I have been going through this drug war for several years now with my husband, who is incarcerated. I have seen things that I didn't know actually took place. It actually opened my eyes to what happens in a prison, what happens when someone is incarcerated, what happens to that family, what happens to their livelihood. Granted, I do have a good job. I do work every day, and I do take care of my daughter, and I don't need any assistance. But there are people out there that don't have that. There are inmates out there that don't get a visit from anybody because they can't afford to drive to Morganton every Sunday for 2 hours. And they can't afford the commissary. They can't afford a phone call. Phone calls will eat you alive just to talk to somebody. And all that inmate wants to do is talk to somebody on the other end. They want to hear a familiar voice. They're so programmed to be institutionalized. My husband was told that they would not move him up in levels. You're in levels when you get incarcerated. You're at level 1. Level 2, you might be able to work outside the facility with supervision. Level 3, you can actually come home for a weekend and see your family. My husband was told he can't move up in levels until he's been incarcerated for 18 months and institutionalized enough before he can even be moved up to even get a job to help pay off the $5,000 fine that he has, or the $25,000 tax bill that he left, that's left sitting, eating interest every day until we can pay it off. A lot of people don't realize that it impacts every aspect of your life, the inmate's life. When we go there on Sundays, people are being released, and they're shaking all over in fear. They're scared. They don't want to leave that facility because that's all they've known for years. There's no outside interaction. The only thing they get is a TV. When you talk to an inmate, you don't talk to somebody that you've seen last week. They're a totally different person. Their attitude changes. They don't comprehend things correctly. You've got to repeat yourself over and over again. Where my husband is at right now, there is no schooling. There are no programs he can take. The only thing that he can do is sit in that facility 24 hours a day, and that's it. This is a man that had 3 jobs. He worked his butt off to take care of us. And now he's sitting, doing nothing. He makes $2.40 a week. A week. That doesn't even cover his toiletries that the prison doesn't pay for. They don't pay for your shaving cream and your soap and your necessities. That comes from the family. So, any help you can give an inmate or an inmate's family is going to impact them probably the rest of their life, because I didn't realize it was going to be that big of an issue. Oh, okay, we lost an income. We didn't just lose an income. We lost our life, and we will, and until 13 months from now, that's what we have to deal with. Yes, we knew the struggle. My husband wasn't an addict. He knew what he was doing. He knew what could happen when he did this. But he still did what he did. So he has to pay the consequences. We all understand that. It's civil disobedience. Our Fletcher Police Department got 85% of the proceeds. It's a cooperative agreement. That's what they get when they arrest a drug dealer. They get money. So why not arrest the drug dealers or so you can get some money to go buy some new equipment while you're infecting a life not only of the person you're incarcerating, but you're infecting their whole family. And we need to start looking at that.
I would like to end this tonight, again, the way we started, and remind you that the whole purpose of this evening is not just to depress you or lay the problem. I mean, there are a lot of things in this world to get depressed about. But it's really to educate you, and hopefully you'll take that education out. You'll talk to people. If you don't do anything else, learn enough so that you can inform them properly and talk to them. But you've also heard a number of ways that you can get involved. A number of ways. I said to the panelists tonight, I'd like to take this show on the road. And I talked to Kathleen Barnes, and Kathleen said, well, I know NAACP in Hendersonville and NAACP in Asheville would be very interested in having this. Every single person up here said yes.
On behalf of the Transylvania NAACP, I give our heartfelt thanks to the Unitarian Universalist Church, to Jim Hardy, to the staff, to our panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we would like to take this show on the road.